This episode is being brought to you by Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Alaska Realty. Whether you're investing in residential, buying or selling commercial properties anywhere in the state of Alaska, we're here to assist. To reach us, you can contact me at lottie@lottiemichael.com or my cell phone, 907-242-7603. And for comments or questions about residential properties, reach out to Connie Yoshimura at 907-229-2703, 229-2703. Hi, I'm Connie Yoshimura. Welcome to the Insider Real Estate Podcast with Lottie Michael and myself. Lottie's not here today, but our special guest is Anna Brawley, who is the new chair of the Anchorage Assembly. So, Anna, welcome. It's really great to see you and for taking your time to come and visit with us. So, I'm going to ask you a couple of personal questions first. How did you get to Alaska?
Good question. So I'm originally from Ohio and was trained as a city planner. So I was in school. It was during the recession, the 2011 recession, looking for a job. And I found out about a job with a consulting firm in Alaska. And when I graduated, I moved up here. They moved me up here. It was Agnew-Beck Consulting. So I was there for about a dozen years. And really, it was at the point in my life that I was ready to put down roots. So I met my partner, James, moved in with him. We're living together and just really have decided this is where I'm going to build my career.
That was a good sort of summary. So you are the first city planner to ever be, in my history of 40-some years, to be actually on the assembly as the chair. So you have a very unique and very special experience to bring to the chair. So
I will say one thing is I know way back Jane Ambeck was on the assembly as well.
Yes,
She was also trained as a planner, but that was a long time ago. She's still
yes, she is. I remember now. Thank you.
And since then, I've also heard, I don't think it was true when he was chair, but Dick Traney actually, I got to talk to him a couple years ago at an event and he was saying, I also went back to school for planning. So we have a few of them, but yeah, it is rare for sure.
It is really very rare for some. So what is your role actually? You are the chair. And so when I think of the chair, I think about running meetings and establishing policies, keeping everybody on a good track and all that sort of thing. But you have a lot of behind the scenes work as well, right?
Yeah.
What are you responsible for?
I think certainly a lot of things. And of course, I have all my member duties. So I still get my constituent emails, still running ordinances. I think the way to describe the chair is maybe three pieces. One is the process. So you mentioned running meetings. When I run a meeting, we're working with our clerk, our vice chair, Daniel Voland, who represents North Anchorage. We meet weekly to really go through the agenda. And it's not, do I like this item or not? It's not how I'm going to vote on it. It's more the procedure to make sure what order are we going to do things? Is there an issue that we anticipate will have a lot of public testimony? Is there something a sponsor brought that they want to postpone? Things like that. So that's one category. It also really includes a lot of relationships. So working with the mayor's office, working with different departments, the municipal manager, again, mostly on agenda. So, for example, we really need this contract passed. So we have a must pass list. It doesn't mean that we can't tell the body, the rest of them, how to vote, but just kind of sense of urgency or what's going on, or we need to postpone this item. And then just generally talking about what's going on at the city. There's big issues. I got a chance to go up to the base to learn about the big expansion of J-Bear. And I know the mayor's office has been in contact with them. So making sure I'm aware of what's going on and thinking about how to educate and kind of bring in other members on those things. And relationships also include with members. So I run the meetings. I am not the supervisor of the assembly. And really we have a culture of your vote is your own. We are 12 peers. So I don't see myself as above the rest of the members, but really keeping in contact with them, dealing with questions they have, or someone says, here's what I want to do. How could I do that? Helping them there. And then the third thing is there is some back end work. So I work very closely with the clerk, the ombudsman. In fact, today I was meeting with the clerk on a couple items. In the chart or in the code, the chair is seen as a department head, which is a weird place to be. I delegate a lot of those things to the clerk, to the ombudsman. I don't manage their staff. And of course, the clerk is separate for elections. So there's no reason why I, the chair, should be involved in the election, whether I'm on the ballot or not. So those pieces, just more keeping tabs with what's going on with staff. signing off on paperwork.
When I've seen you at various assembly meetings, you have been a leader in terms of speaking pro and con and all that sort of thing. Now as chair, do you feel that you're stifled?
I think not stifled, but certainly, I guess like any leadership position, you want to think about the consequences of your actions when I'm using the chair role or speaking from there as a member and trying to keep those things distinct. So for example, there's a mechanism that I pass the gavel to the vice chair and then he recognizes me and I speak as a member. So trying to be careful about those things. But it does mean that there's more calculations. So if I am really pushing on something hard, the public may perceive that as, oh, the branch is doing this, the assembly is doing this. So I have to be careful about that for sure.
I just remember I spent 5.5 years on the Planning and Zoning Commission and a year or so as chair. And I always felt that I really didn't get to express my opinion until after everyone else had their opinion. Yeah. So if you're opinionated, you probably don't want to be a chair, at least in my role, in my capacity.
Yeah.
So what are some of the major issues facing the city of Anchorage right now?
Good question. I think there's multiple issues, but I guess I'll lay out a few. One of my biggest priorities is housing. And I know that's partly why we are here.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah. So I can say that, but I think that is, I do see that not just as an issue for the housing, the industry or residents. It really is. It's an economic issue. It's a social issue where folks can live, where they can afford to live. So that is a big issue. And really, it's such a complex issue, sorting out what the assembly can do about it and what the muni can do about it. That's a challenge. Other issues that I see are related are our budget. So our budget, we are mostly based on property taxes and we have rising costs. We have increasing home values, which then automatically makes your taxes go up. And we're basically paying more for the same services that the city has expected for a long time. And that's with slow cuts over time because of the way our tax cap works, our over-reliance on property tax, loss of state money. So that is a big question, not just for the assembly, but really the whole community. What are we going to pay for? And how do we do that? So and I am hopeful. I think that we have agency. We have the power to make those changes. But the question is, what are we changing and why? So that's a big kind of ball of wax to unpack. But other issues that we're facing, again, that the assembly has a role in education. We know many families are concerned about schools. I just met yesterday with a bunch of high school and middle schoolers, and we asked, what issues do you care about? They said environmental protection, keeping animals safe, and the fact that so many of their own schools have seen their sports cut and other activities. So they are living it, and that is a real issue. And then I think all of the other things that come with that are public safety, making sure we have enough officers on the street, that we're not trying to solve every issue with police, but knowing that if people don't feel safe, the community is not thriving. And then other things, the economy, making sure that we have good jobs, that folks can afford to live here. Affordability is a huge issue. So I think I could go on and on, but I think the bottom line is I think we're at a point where a lot of the things that have worked for Anchorage for a long time are not working as well anymore. And we're at the point that the community needs to make some decisions about where we want to go from here.
So you mentioned one thing about the lack of state funding, and we've seen that in education and in a number of other areas as well. How do you think the state feels about Anchorage? Because I get the feeling that although we have a lot of problems that are related to the state as well, we don't seem to have the support in Juneau that, say, other communities might, like, for example, the Matsu Borough. They seem to get lots of roads and lots of money and all that sort of thing. There's 3 roads between Palmer and Wasilla. It took me a while to figure that out, actually. There was the Parks, there was Bogart, there was Wasilla Fishhook, and they seem to be thriving more and getting more things. Why don't we get more assistance from the state? Do you know?
Good question. I think that's a great question for our state legislators, but I think it is challenging. I think there's multiple dynamics going on. I think and these are not things that I think or want to frame them that way, but I think they're things that we all inherit. The urban versus rural dynamic, this idea of on the road system, off the road system, and in particular Anchorage versus the rest of the folks on the road system versus rural. And I think in a resource constrained environment, it becomes a zero-sum game. And so it's easy to fall into Anchorage already has a bunch of money. Why should they get more? And we do have real serious dire needs in rural Alaska, for example, water systems, schools. And so when you do look at it as a zero-sum game, it's hard to compete with that. I think also we have a much we both have a number of legislators who represent Anchorage and also a lot of politics within that said that we have a very diverse set of representatives, senators and representatives, all the way from Eagle River down to Girdwood. And so I think we have an Anchorage delegation. I really do credit Senator Kaufman and Representative Mears. They have really tried to build up what they call the Anchorage delegation, and not saying we agree on everything, but those folks were very instrumental in getting money for the Port of Alaska, Anchorage's port, for really some other kind of big wins that help Anchorage. But beyond that, it's hard because the interests of Hillside can be different than the interests of downtown, right? So that plays out on the assembly. It plays out within the legislature. And I think it's easier when you have one senator, one representative, it's easier to represent those interests in a much more focused way. And I think just, again, the dynamic has been, I think it's easy to beat up on Anchorage. We're the big city. That happens in other states. When I lived in New York State, people would say Albany the way that we say Juneau.
Okay.
And then
That's
a lot
interesting.
a lot of baggage attached to that, right? And you could say the people claiming corruption or whatever, that when you say the name of the place, there's a lot to it. And then, of course, New York City is the biggest state or biggest city. And if you don't live in either of those areas, you might perceive both of them as those guys get all the resources.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think also things are easier when you have a lot of money. And so
that's
for
true,
across the board,
privately and publicly.
Exactly. So I think in the days of the state, when you had enough money to go around, it was just a matter of, are we doing 50 projects or 40 projects? Now, again, if you would think of things in a resource constraint, then it is us versus them. And so one thing I've tried to do, I'm a member, or the Muni is a member of the Alaska Municipal League. So it's the association of all the local government cities and boroughs. And I've gone to say, this is not about Anchorage versus everybody. I think rising tide can lift all boats. And we have a lot of issues in common as local government. So I've really tried to acknowledge that we are the biggest city in the room, but not coming to say, I'm trying to take resources from you, or it's us versus them. It's more, how do we all work together? So, and I think that if we can foster more of that at the state level, I think that would be a positive.
Now, let's talk about my favorite topic, housing.
Same.
Right, same. Yeah. All right. So there seems to be a lot of opportunities that you have created, like ADUs, the R1 zoning becoming an R2 zoning, other things as well, pre-approved designs for housing, but it's not really moving the needle very much. So can you talk about some of maybe the big items that we need, like infrastructure and who pays for infrastructure or offsite costs and that sort of thing? And then my primary concern, because I believe in home ownership and I've spent my entire business career advocating for home ownership, it concerns me that we're just going to be a camp town. And by a camp town, I mean, we're going to have the majority of our housing is going to be renters. And obviously I was a renter at some point in time in my life, but I don't believe they have the same long-term community interests as a renter that a homeowner does. So how do we get more home ownership?
That's a good question. I guess I can answer that one, or we can go back, because I think there's two big conversations that we can have.
All right.
I think we should start with home ownership. So I used to serve on the board of NeighborWorks Alaska. And one of their missions is home ownership. Of course, they own a lot of rental properties. They briefly had a foray into for sale properties, but also wanting folks to move up the ladder, right? You start with a rental, maybe your family, save up some money. Hopefully you can buy a house then, or buy a unit of some kind. And I think that's really important. And I guess based on my board service and kind of learning more through working with a housing organization, and the more I think about it as a planner and as a policymaker, that I agree with you. I think it's not that homeownership is the only goal. And I know there can be a lot of kind of stigma attached to renting. So I don't want to feed into that. I think there are reasons people rent.
Absolutely.
Including seniors, right? You might downsize and say, I don't want to deal with this house anymore. But I think the homeownership piece is really important. Like you said, not wanting to be a camp town. I think the question I keep coming back to is who owns Anchorage, or who is allowed to own in Anchorage. Because I think what you're describing is, some people would say maybe a company town, right? Yeah, Hershey, Pennsylvania, right? Mr. Hershey or whatever. The company owned the entire town. Right. All the folks who wanted to live there were probably renters, and they were just part of that ecosystem. And I guess as a planner, and again, as a policymaker, I think a lot about the Venn diagram of who owns property and who lives in a place. And a lot of the politics or conflicts or just complex dynamics that happen are, how much do those circles overlap or not? So company town, they don't overlap at all. The people who live there have an interest in that place. They don't own the property. They don't own the land under. A typical suburb in a city where it's all home ownership, maybe that it's 100%. But then where do the folks who work for those people live, right? And so I think it's always going to be a blend. But I think making those two circles as big as possible is really important. And of course, there's commercial property, there's other pieces. But yeah, I think when housing is voters, and it's not that certainly renters should vote, we should all vote, but I think there is, people feel more attached and more engaged and more empowered when they own a little piece of the city. And I think creating more opportunities for that, which means smaller lot sizes, smaller houses, and really continuing to move on the long path we're on, which is becoming a denser city over time, because that's what pretty much every city that's existed up to now, that's the path they're on.
I do think I'm such an advocate of home ownership because for middle America or the working class of America, it is their only opportunity to generate some wealth because we do have continued appreciation. We may have a recession and we may have issues, but overall in a 10 or 20-year span, you are going to have appreciation. And at the same time, you have a commitment to your community and a commitment to your family and your schools. And so to me, home ownership is really not only just a financial and economic and a social, but it's really about family as well. And so I am going back and forth about a day a week, or every 10 days to the Valley. And I know I see the 57,000 cars going back and forth. And it really makes me very sad to see all that, because I know that we've lost over 6,000 residents over the last few years. And a lot of people would say that's because we have a lack of land, not just requirements for the land that there is, but we don't have much land left to develop. Would you say that's true as well, or is there other opportunities for land?
I think we certainly do have some land. I think part of the challenge is most of the land that could be used for housing has buildings on it already, or it did, or it has the shell of a building that burned down. So that's one issue, is redevelopment and infill. And I know we talk about that a lot, but that is, most other cities have already gone through multiple cycles of that. So Columbus, Ohio, where I'm from, is a city that was built in the early 1800s. But when you go to it, most of it looks like it was built in the 50s to 80s, because that's when really the outward expansion of the city happened here and most other cities. It's a newer city, but if you really look downtown, you can find those old buildings.
Yes.
But there's been multiple cycles of those buildings being torn down, replaced, more skyscrapers, right? So it's an interesting microcosm of that. So that's one piece, is how do we reuse either buildings we have or put new buildings on land that's already there? And that's the issue of places like Spenard, Fairview, Mountain View, most of the urban core. Then we also have a bunch of vacant properties that for one reason or another, whether it's regulations or wetlands, people drive around and say, why is that particular property not being built on? Often it's because rules were put on it that make it hard to build. So special limitations, probably some of your audience is very familiar. Projects have been stopped over the years for various reasons. Or the Pete Zamarillo paper plat subdivisions. There's one right across from my district, Laurel Acres, issues like that, where even if on paper you could build there, it's not going to happen. And that's a challenge.
Because of all the variety of owners of those paper platted lots.
Yeah. And just it's on wetlands and building the infrastructure. So infrastructure is a huge one. How do you get to your property? How do you flush the toilet on your property, right? In a city, you can't just put a well everywhere. You can't put a septic system. And then I think the third piece is there are pieces of public land, and that is something the Muni is looking at. ASD has some properties that were laid out years ago to say, okay, we assume we're going to grow. And so we're not going to build a school here. We're going to hold this. There's one in West Anchorage and West Park. The idea is that there should be an elementary school there. That might not be what we need. We're literally closing schools in this moment now. So there's pieces of land there. Heritage Land Bank. A lot of what they own is actually not really feasible to build on.
Yes.
Conservation easements. It's on slopes. It's things that may become parks someday. We just authorized disposal of land in South Anchorage for a natural burial cemetery. And multiple folks said, why are we doing that? Why don't we use it for housing? It's not feasible for housing, but it's a great place to put a cemetery. So I think that's a challenge too, is we have some public lands, certainly some downtown, some elsewhere, but how the process of deciding what those are used for, if they get sold, if they get granted, that's a whole public process.
We want to take a quick moment to thank Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Alaska Realty for supporting this episode. One of the things we appreciate about our team is that our agents do far more than open a door. We help clients understand neighborhoods, evaluate investment opportunities, navigate commercial leases, prepare homes for sale, and make smart long-term real estate decisions. Whether you're a first-time homebuyer or a growing business looking for office space, or a national or international Fortune 500 company exploring opportunities in Alaska, we're here to facilitate and help you. Visit Berkshire Hathaway Home Services AlaskaRealty.com to connect with Lottie Michael at 907-242-7603 or Connie Yoshimura at 907-229-2703. Let's talk about parks. We have more parks per capita than any other city that I know of. And I know that parks and trails are really a very important part of tourism and our recreation. But we have a lot of parks that were just really created adjacent to residential properties that could have gone the other way to provide some housing. But now I understand there's a resolution that all parks there's 2 designations for parks, and they're all going to be never used for anything other than parks. Is that true? Or how does that work?
Let's unpack
I'm putting you on the spot.
No, that's okay. No, we can unpack that. So you're right. There's 2 kind of categories of park. There's dedicated park, which means the public has said this is dedicated and there needs to be, it's either a public vote or an assembly vote to undo that. It is very protected. There's a bunch of designated parks where, and if you stand on the park, you're not going to tell the difference, right? It's maybe got some benches, it's a nice green space. Right. The designated parks have not gone through that process. I know there's some folks in the community who have really advocated for that. And I don't know the story behind all of those lands, but it's basically one example, the land across from Rusted Goat. It's never been dedicated as a park. It's not really built as a park. It's just a
long piece. Yeah.
The Parks and Rec mows sometimes, right? And people, their dogs, they walk their dogs there. Those kind of lands, some of those were actually created by removing housing, is the interesting thing. So there used to be fourplexes on that land. And it went back to the 80s when West Northern Lights was they put it underground. It used to be out grade, or not underground, I'm sorry, under the railroad track. Right. And so they basically had to tape pieces of property on either side. If you drive down Minnesota, Rogers Park, you'll see slices of probably the underlying plats are still there that show residential properties. So when J.J. Brooks bought that land, the Rusted Goat land a few years ago, he's been pursuing a platting action basically to dissolve the underlying plat lines because it looks like one big chunk, but it's also multiple parcels. Anyway, so there's a number of those. I don't know how they came into the community's possession over time. Some were road projects. I used to live on Cope Street in Spenard, across from Cope Street Park. That one is actually 3 residential lots that I don't know. I'm assuming they had houses. I don't know if they did, but that's now a city park. And so coming back to the question, there's those 2 designations, but actually what we just did on the assembly is a separate thing, which is looking at our land use map. So the designation on the land use map says this thing is a park, but maybe it's still marked on the map as residential because, again, it was a house that was turned into the Muni or whatever it was. Uri Park in Spenard is like that. There used to be a Lions Club house. It was deeded to the city, turned into a park, but no one ever cleaned up the legal underpinnings of that. So what we did on our assembly agenda, the planning department went through a process to basically redesignate, if it's already a park, like Cope Street Park was on there, okay, we're going to assume that's still going to be a park. And so it's not designated as residential on the map anymore. And some of them were actually rezoned to, I think PLI is the park land. But the reverse was true. Some of them were marked as park. They're not being used that way. And they're private properties that could turn into housing. And so some of it, the reverse happened too. There was it was a big cleanup ordinance that really also speaks to, there's just a lot of cleanup that we have to do in our codes and our mapping and those kind of systems.
I drive around a lot to the various neighborhoods and I see neighborhood parks and no one's in them because everyone in home ownership wants to have a little bit of a backyard. And now because of all safety concerns and the changes in our society, all these neighborhood parks are vacant and Parks and Rec has no money to take care of them. And so they're just sitting there. And I'm trying to figure out why can't we build houses on some of these parks? Because they're not being used, because our culture and our recreational activities have changed so much that families don't send their children 2 blocks away to go to a park?
Yeah, I think it's a valid question. I think, and I would not be a good Anchorage politician if I just said, oh yeah, we should rezone all the parks. But I think it is a question. I think people do value their green space. And what you bring up, it comes back to the interconnection between our infrastructure and the people we need to maintain that infrastructure, our services and housing and our tax base. So if we have too many places that we're maintaining as public spaces, and you're right, we don't have enough folks to really do that. We have a lot of demand on our parks department. They're cleaning up camps, they're cleaning up trash, they're maintaining thousands of acres or however many we have of all the beautiful parks that people love. But if we don't have enough folks to maintain that, then they do either come into disrepair or they're just not utilized. And uses change over time. Like you said, I know there's more people now playing pickleball. And so there's been this ongoing conversation, do we convert all of our tennis courts into pickleball? And of course, people still play tennis, but how do you meet users' need and how much physical space do you need to do that? So I think it's one of many big conversations that I know will generate a lot of feelings that are valid and a lot of what is the best use of our land. But I think that is a conversation we need to have and really drill down to. I don't think anyone's proposing to build housing in Kincaid. But as you're saying,
Little neighborhood parks.
Yeah. And some of which might have been a house at some point.
They could have been. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. No, I can think of multiple examples that it's one little parcel that turned into a little pocket park that's great if someone's using it, but it was a house and it could be a house again.
I think the benefit of all of that is, as a residential land developer and having to put in infrastructure, these little neighborhood parks, they already have infrastructure because they're on a publicly dedicated street and their neighbor is someone that has gas and electricity, water and sewer. So they're quite easy to actually be developed for housing that would be compatible to their neighborhood. And so I just see that as an excellent opportunity to be able to afford some reasonable housing. So you could even do it as far as a little bit of low density, because I don't think if you're next door to a 6,000 square foot lot, people probably wouldn't object to townhouses or smaller. There we could go. All right. So as chair of the Anchorage Assembly and your reelection for a 3-year period of time, tell us what your goals are.
Yeah.
I
think, and I know I'll bring it back to the prior question, which is what do we do about our housing situation? What are our options? And so I think one of my goals is to really continue to push on those big changes that we need to make. And the categories I think are, I guess there's 2 different levels. There's what are the pieces of the housing issues that we need to fix, the cost and the need for infrastructure. So the fact that a lot of places in the middle of our city don't have pipes in the ground. That is a huge cost and a huge issue. And our code is built to make the private developer, which means to make the new residents pay for public infrastructure. That works if you're building a whole new neighborhood of 300 homes. It doesn't work if you're Cook Inlet Housing Authority and you're putting in 1 building, 2 buildings, and you have to put in a sewer main. So figuring out how to pay for that, I think, and that's not going to be something the city can do on its own. That is federal advocacy, because we're not the only city that is dealing with this. I think I've asked the question many times, why do we every year by formula get a bunch of money from the federal government for surface transportation for roads, and there's no equivalent to that for pipes in the ground? There's certainly EPA
Next to the
money.
roads,
And there is money for clean water. There's pieces that you can do, but it's not an assumption that you always need that money every year. That is something that we should advocate for. The things in our control are our zoning code, our permitting process, and some levers we can pull with our tax base, our tax incentives. So we've done some work on incentives. We've done some work on zoning. The permitting process is not something the assembly can control. That is really the administration and how they staff and how they train, things like that. But I think the more complicated our code, the more that those staff are spending time flipping through pages, trying to, it says you can do that here, this other piece says you can't, and trying to reconcile that. So cleaning up the code is a way to improve the permitting process. It's not the only way. Beyond that, I think the question of stepping back, looking where we put how we utilize our land, how we encourage others to use their land, the infill development, things like that. And I think the harder part on the affordability side is the stuff we don't have control over, which is financing. I know we've talked about that, both for building and then also for consumers to have an affordable mortgage. I think that is a huge issue. We can't change the Fed's interest rate. We can't do those things, but that's where looking how to make it possible to build at a lower price point is the only thing that we can really control. In terms of goals, then, I think I want to keep moving the ball forward as far as I can on all of those things, knowing that I can't unilaterally change them. And I also know there's a lot of things that come up at the assembly. Some of them are distractions, they're political noise, whatever it is. There's a lot of other urgent issues. And so the challenge and one of my goals really is just continuing to keep the focus on what matters and what we really need to be spending our limited time on.
I think in general, it's very interesting because we have such a small population in such a huge state, right? So our population so we're closer to all of our politicians, our elected officials, than say a city like, or a state like Arizona or Texas or Washington. Everybody except every state has more population than we do except Wyoming. So we're closer to our politicians. We see them walking down the street. We see them at restaurants. We can stop and say, blah, 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 blah. Why did you do this? So it's a more difficult process to govern, I would think, because we have big issues in a huge geographical state and small population.
Yeah.
So everybody's got a voice.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody has a voice.
I think the more that I do this job and having worked as a planner in this community as well, I think the more I realize we have to also change this dynamic or this assumption by some that the government is doing things to you, or that I'm responsible for figuring out all the problems, coming up with solutions, and then also anyone who doesn't like anything about any of the solutions, it's my fault. I'm not saying that to be defensive. I think it's a question of what is the entire community's responsibility and willingness to change. I think, and it's not change just for the sake of change. It's really, there are some real things that are not working. And we continually, especially with things like zoning, get in this dynamic where folks say everything is perfect in the code. Our intent was clear in the code, and therefore whatever we wrote down is actually working in real life. And we don't really question that assumption. And then it becomes the dynamic that I know you've lived and others have. It's, oh, the developers are the problem, right? That there's this binary of the developers versus the neighbors. And missing in that conversation is the folks who aren't living there yet. They also have a stake, whether they exist now or in the future. And also, again, the broader community interest of where the folks who don't have a lot of money, who basically make everything work, our labor, where do they live?
And they're the ones that don't have the opportunity because they're working two jobs. They're taking their kids to activities and all that sort of thing. So they're not the ones that show up at the community council.
Yeah.
And so, but they're the ones that have the people that show up at the community council are the ones that get the recognition, the dialogue, and take the time. But there's this, what I guess I will call the silent majority, who's living in these homes and want to have more opportunities on the housing ladder, but they're much too busy taking care of their family and their job to go and speak out at a public meeting.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to that Venn diagram of owning property versus living there. And obviously, if you're a homeowner, you're in that circle. But for all the folks who don't own property, but like you said, whether they're renters or a 20-year-old who's figuring out what their life's going to be, maybe they're not immediately going to own a home, but do they even see that as possible? And then I think the dynamic in the community on a number of issues, which is we recognize we don't change things, or we recognize that things have been better before. We want things to change in theory, and then every single possible tangible thing that we talk about is change that would actually address those issues. It becomes I don't want this change. And there's valid feelings and valid reasons to have that dialogue. What is the right answer? We don't want to just change everything overnight. But that if we are unwilling as a community to entertain even thinking about the solutions that would fix the problems that we all complain about, if we can't get past that, then we can't get anywhere. So I think another goal of mine really is to continue to surface that, to name it, to say that it is okay to be reluctant about change, to be worried, but we cannot continue on the status quo like that. And there is a huge cost if we do that. I think that's where I want to put that at the feet of the community, not just in housing, but in a number of areas.
I think that's a good opportunity, and I appreciate you being here, and I wish you good luck. You've got a big job to do, and I feel that the Assembly and Anchorage is in better hands as a result of your experiences that you have, and so you bring a different approach to it as a planner, as a city planner, and I welcome that opportunity. Yeah. So thanks for coming. Yeah, I appreciate it very much. Hello, everyone. This is a little bit of an extra that we're going to do at the end of every podcast. We're going to interview one of our Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Alaska Realty who's just completed a transaction. And so we're here today with Brittany Moses in her very, very nice office. I love your office. It looks really great.
Thank you.
How long have you been in real estate?
11 years.
11 years. So you know a lot, right?
I do.
Yeah. How did you end up, or how did you come to acquire this listing opportunity.
Yes, I had just closed on another multifamily property, and it was a difficult transaction, but very challenging, and it was wonderful experience actually. And so they referred me to a family member for another multifamily transaction, and I was not the first agent, so I came into an aging property that had already been on the MLS and got it sold.
So I'm wondering if because you have these multifamily opportunities, didn't you tell me at one point in time that you have an accounting background?
I do. Yes. Yes, I have an accounting background. It seems like another lifetime, but yes, I did accounting.
Okay. Well, and you graduated here at UAA?
I didn't fully graduate at UAA. I actually graduated at University of Phoenix. So I did a hybrid. So half UAA, half University of Phoenix.
Do you think having that accounting background helps you in real estate?
Definitely. It allows me to understand the numbers behind these transactions, and it really helps me in a lot of deals, actually.
What was the most difficult part of the transaction?
Gaining the seller's trust. And because they were very weary, and they didn't think that we were all on the same team. So coming to that and getting them to understand we're in this together. I'm here for you. I'm here for to make sure that everything works out in your favor and everyone walks away happy. And that's what we did.
All right. So is this the second or third or fourth or fifth multifamily property that you sold?
Yeah, it's probably the fifth, actually. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So tell us about fourplexes in today's market. There aren't any new fourplexes, are they? Most of them are older.
Most of them are older. Yeah, especially in Anchorage. You'll see them out in Wasilla, but in Anchorage, it's definitely an aging product.
So what are some of the challenges with an aging product like that?
Repairs, inspections. Mm-hmm. And a lot of things are coming up on those inspections that they're big ticket items.
Who pays for some of those issues, I guess? Does it usually come, that's the negotiating part, right?
That's definitely the negotiating part. Yeah.
What's your negotiating theory? Do you have a protocol that you follow? Do you have...
Not necessarily. It's more so picking and choosing the battle, right? You're either going with the cost up front or the seller doing the repair, coming down more so with credits so that the buyer can do their own repairs and everyone can be happy, because typically people have a different idea of how something should be repaired and the quality of work.
So it's better to put it on the buyer side.
Correct.
To give an allowance or a cost benefit or closing costs, and let the buyer do those repairs, because then he's going to be satisfied with them. He's the one that's going to have selected the contractor to do the work, and so the liability then is really off of the seller.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. We've just had a very similar situation like that in an older resale property. But the question I think that is most important, do you recommend that a seller get a home inspection or a property inspection prior to putting the property on the market or after?
That depends on the property, but
okay.
I think it's helpful if the seller is aware that there's items that could pop up and they're willing to get it done. But then it also can give this, if the seller's not going to do it, they can disclose it and then price it accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, that's where that helps.
All right. Well, that's Brittany Moses, and who sold 5 multifamily properties in the last couple of years.
Yes, for sure.
And what helps her a lot is her accounting background. So if you have a multifamily property that hasn't sold, right, you should call Brittany because she can get the job done. Thank you.
Thank you, Con.
Thanks again to Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Alaska Realty for sponsoring this episode. If you're thinking about buying, selling, or investing in the great state of Alaska, be sure to contact us. Connie Yoshimura at 907-229-273, or for commercial activity, Galati Michael, CCIM at 907 242 7603.